Thank you, Cricket. Thank you to all of you for coming today, and thank you to our panelists who agreed to take part in this discussion, the marriage of music and film. My name's John Haley. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I was here at Tallgrass last year to show a film, and really excited to be back in a different capacity this year. So I thought just to start out, we could have each of the panelists up here. We can just go down the line and have each of you introduce yourself. Anything you want to include is great, but especially kind of what brings you to the festival this year and what your involvement looks like in the festival this year. So we can start with Sean.
All right. I'm Sean Rhodes. My film, The Sunshine Dreamer, premieres tonight at the Orpheum at 7 o'clock, in case there's any confusion by looking at the grid. This is my fourth or fifth film here at Tallgrass, and it's great to be back. And a lot of the stuff I've done has been music documentaries, and this one is definitely music related. It's about the first human being ever treated with mesenchymal stem cells who had Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it worked. And he was a musician, so he was able to live about 17 years longer than most people with the condition have, and live out a full life. Not to giving anything away, that's all in the log line, kind of.
My name is Rudy Love Jr. I am a musician, and I was lucky enough to land the gig playing after the film tonight at the Orpheum. Just a quick plug, and Sean is my like an uncle to me. He did a documentary on my family and my father's music, and so I'm here basically because of nepotism.
My name is Alexis Sprake, and I'm here this year with a music documentary, The World According to Allie Willis, that's playing here at the Century 2 tomorrow at 2 p.m. and it's Sunday at 5 p.m. Allie Willis was, not a well-known person, but she was a songwriter. Her music was really well-known. She wrote September, Boogie Wonderland, the musical The Color Purple. She wrote the Friends theme song, and a lot of other music that didn't break through quite as much, but she was very proud of. And she started filming and documenting her life in the 1940s and 50s in Detroit. And she bought a piano in 1969. She kept the classified ad, and she left her final art piece to be someone putting together the trail that she left behind. And I was lucky enough to get to be the person to do that. So it's a really beautiful story about her own struggles with her identity and sexuality and journey to self-acceptance through songwriting.
Hi, I'm Catherine Propere, and I'm on the jury this year for the Stubbornly Independent section, which is a section that I won an award in last year for a feature film I wrote and directed called Lost Souls, which has hip-hop music in it.
Wonderful. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So I wanted to, just before we jump into questions, say too, I have some prepared questions for all of you, a couple, for each of you individually, but I also this should be a discussion as much as possible too. So if someone says something and you want to jump in and have something to add to what one of you have said, please feel free to do so. I don't want to have my questions just be controlling the conversation, and also please feel free to push back on any of the premises of my questions too and say that's actually not how it happened, or I disagree. And then we'll also get some audience questions in too. So I wanted to start though. So this panel is about the marriage of music and film. Hopefully a happy marriage, but maybe sometimes there's kind of some tension in that. And so I wanted to start off by hearing from each of you about how you see the connection between music and film, maybe what that relationship between music and film looks like at best. Is there some kind of guiding philosophy or some sort of marker that tells you or guides you towards that ideal relationship, that ideal marriage between music and film? And anyone who wants to start can feel free to do so.
I can start. I also, my background is doing a lot of music documentaries, but I also work as a screenwriter. And I think for me, music really helps set tone of narrative. So I usually, especially with something scripted, start with a playlist and put together my musical choices. And I often listen to it while I'm, working on the piece. And I think it does really help. Like, it establishes time and place and kind of that feeling and soul that you're trying to convey. And I think it's a great kind of, I don't want to call it a cheat because it's inspiration, but I do think it makes the whole process like a little bit more streamlined and efficient when you are laying down a story. And then obviously when you're doing an actual, like with my documentary that I have here, it's literally depicting music and a narrative about music. I think that the challenge is, how do you let the music actually come through in the narrative and do some of the work of the storytelling, and not, because there's nothing worse than watching a film that's telling you about music but not actually letting you listen to it or hear it. So that's always, I think, a little bit of a competing and delicate balance, because when you get really into it, you're almost like, could I just let this whole thing play? But of course, you have a 90-minute canvas or whatever it is. So making those choices and figuring out when is the right time to punctuate and when is the right time to really just like let it breathe.
I'd say if film is the sentence, then music has to be the punctuation, and sometimes it can be an exclamation point or a question mark. But it for me is everything. It's sort of my other path to discovering my love for music. Watching my pops score or compose music specifically for movies, it always excited him. And I sort of carried on with that tradition of, when I'm writing a song, I'm already imagining a scene in my head, and it really helps when that scene is very detailed and already something tangible. So I think that that's all I got to say about that.
I know for me, I never felt that talented as an individual artist. I was much more of a consumer of different artistic mediums. I love music, I love painting, I love theater. And I remember I took an opera history class in college and learned Wagner's term Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total work of art, and thought that film was kind of like that today because it brings together so many other art forms: the visual arts, the audio arts, music and acting and performance and storytelling. And I think for me, like, what I like about directing is getting to work with people who I admire and think maybe are even more talented than I am, or people who are talented and don't know it themselves, and kind of providing a platform for us to collaborate and make art together.
I think the only thing I would add is that music is a way to kind of weave your whole story together. And it can also punctuate parts within the story of the film and bring it out a little bit more. And there's a lot you can do with it. I mean, you can use that emotion negatively or positively, and it could be in a way clashing with itself. So you can really bring out those emotions in your storytelling when it comes to making film and marrying it with music.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for that first question. I wanted to get, I think we learned so much too from looking at like specific moments and specific decisions made in films, whether they're your films or someone else's. And I'm sure those can kind of like, challenge or reconfigure how we think of this relationship too. And so I'm curious if any of you have a moment either in your own creative process, or it can be someone else's work too that sparked something in you, but where you saw that maybe your previous understanding of how music and film connected or interrelated, or how they related to each other, maybe when you saw that reconfigured or challenged or recast in some new light, or maybe it confirmed kind of what you already knew. But is there any moment kind of in any of your own projects or any other projects you've seen that you kind of go back to as something that maybe sparked some shift in your understanding of this relationship? Please.
So This Is Love. We predominantly used older music for the soundtrack. I think maybe 8 of the songs out of the 10 or 11 songs that are on there. I can't exactly remember, but there were a few new ones that I got to co-produce and write with my pops, and it didn't really start that way. So "Give Me My Money" was a song that the movie itself is largely centered around industry abuse and the credit swaps and the bad practices of the music industry. So when we were writing that song, when Dad had that in mind, it was this really fun, like, I think we were recording it at Mindfire, which is now Shocker Studios, man. And it just felt like this kind of like sort of carefree, like, and I had known my dad all my life at that point. And I'd always seen him very kind of playful with that subject. But then seeing that once Sean and John and JC put it in the film and where it sat, it brought out this new emotional point of view of seeing, visualizing my father's pain in that. And though it was still, had a sense of humor in it, it felt different. And I realized the power of visual context to, something that you create. It's everything. Because I think that a lot of us, when we are listening to something, we're picturing something. I think I've already said this, but it's sort of like once it gives you the picture, it can, it's essentially propaganda. It can insert a specific emotion. So that was the realization I had that.
I'm just going to add to that, is though when we were making the film with your dad, who he and I were very close friends, and bringing up this old music that he sometimes couldn't perform himself because he had such bitter memories of it being stolen from him and all these other artists making money off of it. For instance, "Your Love Is So Doggone Good," which was recorded by Ray Charles and Isaac Hayes, just for a couple of people, that going through that emotion and reliving that and bringing it out in the film actually turned out to be a very healing process for Rudy and the whole entire family, including Rudy Jr. here.
Yeah.
And one thing that it's maybe not directly answering your question, but that I use a lot when I'm talking to people setting the look of a film, especially at the documentary, that I've really learned from music, is that a lot of times the emotion comes through, Ray Charles was the master of this. He never sang the same song the same way, performing however many nights a year. And it's like that moment that your voice cracks or that you don't make the note, and the soul that you and the personality that you put into it. And I often feel like, at least in my approach to filmmaking, that I'm saying to my DP or to my crew in general, that some of the imperfections are actually helping with the authenticity. And sometimes now I think there is a challenge because our tools of production have gotten to be so affordable at such a high level. I mean, you watch like The Bachelor and it could be Born Identity. They've got, helicopter cams and all of this stuff. And sometimes those perfections, I think, do take away that level of perfection, and execution can take away from the feeling of authenticity. And so I do think it's good to go back to how music makes you feel and when and why it makes you feel that way, and learn from it in terms of how you're approaching filmmaking. Sometimes that perfection is exactly what you're going for, but that overproduced sound that's coming through in pop music today too often lacks that emotional stir that I think at least brought me into becoming a music lover in the first place.
I think for me, music represents feeling the most of the aspects in film. And I don't know, some moments that came to mind in movies that I just love how the music works in those films, like Bernard Herrmann's score in Vertigo. It captures the mood and the tone of that movie, and you don't have to remember the plot, but you hear that haunting score. Or, I don't know, obviously like in 2001 when you hear the Blue Danube and the spaceship comes out, or in Malcolm X when he's like walking to his assassination and A Change Is Gonna Come is playing. Like those are some movie moments with music that I love.
Thank you all. I wanted to ask some individual questions too. And so Alexis, I know you're here for The World According to Ellie Willis, right? And I wanted to ask, I'm looking forward to seeing the film, and I saw the trailer, and there's that moment where she says, and I have the quote written down, "I've always known my final art piece would be someone putting together the trail she left behind," which I thought was so beautiful. And then I know she's spoken at other points about like parties that she would throw as the space where like film and design and music and all these passions of hers got to live together in the same place. And so I'm curious if you can talk about that trail left in her music and other pieces of her life, and what it looked like to try to put that together. And maybe if there were moments where and I think you kind of alluded to this in your first answer, but you were talking about when, not letting music speak for itself, I guess, and not kind of forcing narrative on those moments. And so I'm curious if you can talk about like what it looked like to balance all these different pieces of whether it's music or whether it's the video she filmed or other like pieces of her life, and try to decide like what was speaking, what was the most dominant, I guess, trace at individual moments, or kind of how it looked like to weigh all of those things together and try to wed them together in this story.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because that was I inherited through this project, over 10,000 hours of footage and just an immense archive. And you have to be able to make choices quickly, to work with that amount of material. And so the question I wanted to answer in approaching it was, why did she want someone else to do this project? Because if you see my film, you'll see that she was a master of many trades. I mean, she was an artist and an art director, and she could have easily made the documentary. It would have been probably 20 hours long, but she could have made a documentary herself. And really what it came down to, and if you see what Ali looks like through her whole life, from after she basically wrote September until she passed away in her 70s, she had this asymmetrical haircut and this extremely flamboyant style, and she really stood as this beacon of self-acceptance and individuality, and was like this extremely positive person. And everyone we interviewed, that was what they always had to say about her. And so what was really fascinating in the archives, and then in turn in her music, was that there was this this vulnerability and fragility and this internal struggle with self-acceptance that most of us have. It didn't seem like she seemed impervious to those things in her lifetime, but I realized the reason she left the film to someone else is that she didn't really figure out in her lifetime how to bridge both, but she sort of felt to be understood and to complete her life's work, which was really to activate creativity in other people, which is why she wanted to stand out and sort of give you permission to be a bit extra. She needed to show that side of herself and let people into the fact that it was difficult for her and that she did battle the same self-doubt that we all do. And so I had these diaries that had lots of instructions for whoever was directing the film and all this material, but I didn't have this interview with her where she could have said any of the really vulnerable, fragile things. And what was so funny, because her music is like, these are all the songs I mentioned, and also Neutron Dance, and there are these extremely infectious hooks, they're upbeat, they're pop songs. But what we started to realize is that in the lyrics, she sort of took this note from Motown. She grew up in Detroit, so that was a huge influence for her. She put all of the dark stuff into the lyrics and just set it to these much more infectious, upbeat hooks. And so we really did let her lyrics, in a lot more obscure songs at times, but be almost like the interview I didn't get, and breathe in the film, which was really fun to play with. And it was really stunning, because I think that was her biggest skill as a songwriter, was distilling her own emotional experiences into these extremely universal and accessible. That's why the same person that wrote the Friends theme song could write September. She was so good at connecting to people with just these very simple but profound lyrics, and she really did say it all in them. And that's a very unique situation, as a music documentary. But it was I called her life partner, who spent 30 years with her, and I was like, you need to get this album and this album, read the lyrics, because she didn't know any of it. She kept saying to me, I didn't know any of this stuff when she was alive. And I'm like, just read. She was telling everyone the entire time. It was just contained. So
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that. I guess like yeah, creating that space for the lyrics then to kind of like carry that weight too is still a way of like respecting and centering the music in that process too.
Yeah, no, it was really satisfying, and sometimes it's almost like too on the nose, like you feel like, is this a joke? You could cut to something like that, but I think she understood that, and I think that music does that. It makes you feel seen, and it deals with some of the darker things, but the actual feeling of listening to it is uplifting you at the same time, or feeding you emotionally. So trying to achieve that feeling or replicate that with the way we balance the music and her story in the film was a really fun challenge.
Yeah. Well, Rudy, I wanted to ask you too. So I know, you're a musician, and you talked about like when you create songs, you kind of like see these scenes and see these images in your head. And I'm curious about, because I think we can learn a lot from you too of like what it means to like have music that might be written with like one thing in mind that maybe then is kind of someone is bringing into a different vision, right? Like, have you ever had any experiences where you might write a piece or write something and then it's requested for some work that's different than what you might have envisioned? And I'm curious how you go about that process, or what that looks like for you on your side.
I think that's almost every single time that you make something. You realize once you create it and you share it, it's no longer for you. It belongs to whoever's consuming that art or observing that art. There's often times where I thought I was being very direct and on the nose with what I was trying to say, and I heard 5 or 6 different interpretations of what I was saying, and realizing how context matters so much. So when you speak about the writing something very personal and very, you have to really dive deep in order to understand someone's psyche or state of mind when they're creating something, in order to understand, if they are lyrics that are coming from a place of torture, but they're to a happy beat, that can change the context. A lot of times I like to get online and watch, like movies, you can do the same thing, like the scenes where they, have Darth Vader walking in, and it's Careless Whisper playing instead of things like that. So I think that realistically, if I had to say, if I had to speak to one particular time, I wrote a song called "Like She Can," which was a few years back now. And it is about a relationship. A guy gets cheated on, and the woman happens to cheat on him with another woman, and that's pretty on the nose. But then a friend of mine wanted to do a short film to it, and so he composed wrote an entire script and everything. And watching it play out, I was like, I imagined all these little details in these moments, and where he took it, it made sense based off of the lyrics that I wrote, but he just played it out differently in his head. So, yeah, I guess I think that's my answer.
Yeah. Well, and what does it look like for someone to do that respectfully, I guess, as opposed to
it's one. I mean,
yeah.
Whether they do it respectfully or unintentionally and it's disrespectful, or whether you like the result or you hate it, as an artist you just want someone to receive it in some kind of way. So I think that I've never been disrespected when something's misinterpreted, but when it's done in a way that opens your eyes to the art that you created, it's one of the coolest feelings in the world, because you see a different side of it, and you understand, like, sometimes I glean different higher or deeper truths to what I was writing by someone else's interpretation of it. So, or yeah.
That sounds like the ideal
Yeah.
marriage there of like, you know, it's generative and it's not destructive, I guess.
Yeah.
Sean, I'm curious too. So you produced This Is Love, of course, and then you're The Sunshine Dreamer too. Both films about musicians, right? And so, how does it? Can you talk a little bit about? You know, it feels like this pretty big challenge where like you want these songs, this music to inform the structure of the documentary itself, but how do you go about like working and matching existing songs to moments in the film? And you know, I think from the opening scenes of This Is Love, you know, and the song that's playing and talking about Rudy being unknown, right, or being less known, right? Like, how do you, what does that process look like for you of kind of making that a meaningful parallel between songs and plot? And
I think what you do is you plan it out as much as you can. And then as you get into the weeds of the editing, it's weird how things start to shape themselves. And maybe sometimes what you plan doesn't really work, but suddenly, bang, light bulb goes on and something else works, and you're like, oh, that works in there really good. And a lot of the times, and not to blow like a secret here, but something just completely random and unexpected happens to where it just makes sense with this particular song, and you weren't expecting that at all, but you go, ooh. I'm not going to tell anybody that was like almost like a mistake, but it looks like it's genius. But so that stuff will happen at times. But I mean, there is something to be said for planning this out. But there also are like unexpected, like universal things that happen with the music that it just kind of all of a sudden it just evolves on its own. I don't know if that. I'm sure that's happened with anybody who's ever done that.
You're riffing, it's jazz. Bro.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it just kind of like it's unexpected, like brilliance, but you're like it's like shh, don't tell anybody.
Well, Rudy, I think you mentioned that happening with a couple songs in the film that you obviously had known for so long.
Well, you know, speaking about exactly what you were talking about, the that opening moment, I think that y'all caught a acapella of Dad doing a take. I could hear in his voice from playing with him all those years and listening to him. He was a little bit tired from traveling. He was doing it, and you could hear it. But with you know the contrast of them talking about this voice, and it's sort of like this beautiful moment where you hear pain and passion, the marriage of the two, and dedication in this moment where he's just kind of singing Same Run over, or you know, I don't know where he was in the process of recording that specific thing, but it was something else to hear, man, because I guess I have a little bit more context to the story, but it's a hell of an opening, you know? Yeah.
Wow. Catherine, I wanted to ask you, so you obviously showcased Lost Souls here at Tallgrass last year. And as I understand it, in the process of making the film, you worked with a soundtrack that the cast built themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, the cast and also other producers and instrumentalists that aren't on in front of the camera.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just really curious about that process of the soundtrack, you know, emerging from that filming process, and how you as a director like built a space where that could happen, and where that type of collaboration was so welcomed and encouraged. And as a kind of second part, like how did that change how you and maybe the members involved with that thought about like ownership of that music too?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because there were different, I guess, parts of the process with how the music came together. The first sort of step was creating the songs that we knew were going to be like in the concert scenes in the movie. And so in pre-production, before we had actually cast all the actors, and a lot of the actors are first-time actors, real musicians playing musicians on screen. And so we had a band camp in New York for 4 days where we had, I guess, like 3 of the actors, and then producers, guitarists, people's friends, cousins, and like random people who were just like in the room. And we knew that we were going to be holed up for those 4 days, basically just to make like 6 to 7 songs that we had to make for the movie. And you talked about ownership. So it was a very collaborative process. Like sometimes it would be someone saying like, oh, hey, like I have this chord or this beat. Sometimes it would be like in the script, it would have like, there would be like a reference song, right? Like it would be like, this needs to sound like Industry Baby. And then like we would tinker around with like a beat that was similar to that reference song, and then maybe a few of the rappers would have different verses, and it was very much like people riffing off of each other and like jazz, and it didn't really feel like there was, I don't know, like one main producer or like main songwriter, because everyone contributed. And I mean, everyone who contributed on the songs are listed as songwriters and producers for, I guess, like the masters. I'm not great with the terminology, but there's like the publishing and the masters. And so we have like 12 people listed, and they all are equally sort of sharing in the splits in that way. So even if like somebody wrote like more of the song, for everyone who was there for those 4 days, for those songs that were written during the band camp, the splits are even between everyone who was in the room. And then separately, there were also songs sort of written as we were filming, because in our downtime and on our days off, the artists would be making music. And sometimes it would be like 2 people who would just be like, oh, I already have this beat, like, do you wanna write the song lyrics and rap on it? And for those songs, we would have the splits be for whoever actually participated in the songs. But yeah, it was a very like organic process, and I think just bringing together that many creative people and people with different talents, it was sort of like an explosion of a lot of like creative output, and it definitely inspired the process, because sometimes we'd be filming a scene and it would be like, I don't know, like it was supposed to be like a sad scene, let's say, but everybody's like super hyped up and kind of in like a party mood, and they're like, look, Catherine, we just made this song, like let's put it in the movie. And then I would be like, okay, well, I guess no one's gonna be able to do this sad scene, so might as well just like do what everybody wants to do, and like kind of improvise with what the artists are kind of bringing, and the energy that's like the reality of that present moment. And if you watch the film, there are scenes that are kind of off the cuff and spontaneous like that weren't scripted per se, and just were incorporated because that was the reality that we were living.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That sounds incredible. And was that very different from ways you'd worked before, or was it built off anything you'd previously done, kind of?
Yeah, well, this was my first feature film, so it was the most ambitious in terms of just like the sheer number of days and cast that we had. It is similar to how I worked, though, on my 2 prior short films, because in both of those shorts, I worked with a lot of first-time actors, one of whom actually is the lead in Lost Souls, and who's a musician in real life. And yeah, I mean, the shorts definitely inspired the feature, but the feature was like its own learning experience. And I would say that I like came to the process with an open mind, kind of knowing that when you make a film with sort of less resources and not a lot of experienced people, you kind of are open to, I don't know, like the mistakes just being part of the film, and kind of like running with whatever happens, because you don't have that control of being able to be like, give me this performance, because you're a professional actor who does this for all the time and has emotional prep, and you kind of have to like work with what you have. And yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm curious. I have more questions to ask, but I wanted to open it up and really quickly ask if there were any questions from the audience. Yeah.
I've had directors tell me in interviews that sound is much more important to them than image, because sound is visceral. Image, you have to figure out in your brain. Sound hits you with vibration. So I wanted to ask how you use that knowledge in reaching and informing your audience. And the second question I have is, what is, in a music documentary, what is the relationship between the music and sound design?
There's like I think there's this, I don't know who did the study, but in a movie theater, if the image goes out, people will, but the sound is still good, they'll stay and watch for much longer before like complaining to a technician than if the sound goes out and the image is still on, they'll be up right like that with a complaint. So I do think there is something kind of fundamental there. You know, with my current film that I'm showing here, we had her music. We also had a score, which was actually amazing. We got Mark Mothersbaugh, if anyone knows him, but he is from one of the founding members of Devo and does a lot of like Wes Anderson films and other things. And then sound design, which, you know, I think we had a lot of fun with it because we had all of this archive, and she was like a really larger than life personality. So we used it to punctuate, and we just had a lot of, I guess what you call like MOS footage, because it was like old camcorders and stuff would just pick up every noise. You're not going to subject your audience to that. So it's an opportunity to either decide, you know, to bring it to life or not. And so I liked it because you could have like you know, even in the opening of the film, we're using Neutron Dance, one of her songs, but we layered in a bunch of audio that we took from archive to kind of create another level of interaction with her. And then we had voiceover, you know, all at the same time. And to me, it just gives like a fullness to it, because I think documentaries can feel kind of flat if the video B-roll is just sort of being treated as like paint by number, and it's like just literally showing you what you're hearing about. And there's not, but like you're out on the street or there's a car driving, you don't hear the street, you don't hear, you know, that always really bothers me when I'm watching films. So I try to approach it more like a scripted film, but I think you're creating like a whole aural world in addition to the visual world. It's all part of it. And for me, it's all just like more fleshier material, like that you can make the whole thing more immersive.
Yeah, I don't think you can separate them, and they're two separate things, but they're both the sound, and they help punctuate. So you can have the music there in the background, but then, you know, with the other sound design and different sound effects and elements in there, that's how you can really bring it out and tell your story better, which is really what it's about, you know, the storytelling.
Do you ever use subsonic sound? Sound that vibration that you can't hear? And consider that as part of the audience's experience, or I don't know. I mean, these are music documentaries, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's something you could definitely do. I mean, it's like, I don't know that, like with a lot of the films that I've done, we've had the type of theaters that are able to do that, and especially when you're working film festivals. But you could. I mean, I would.
Yeah, I mean, I've never done that, but I do think maybe in a similar vein, like. There's moments like in the narrative with Allie Willis where she says something extremely dark, and you could just leave it that way. But if I really want to make sure that the audience hears it, I'll use maybe a trope from a horror film, even though it's not meant to be scary, but just some sort of, you know, guttural, deep sound that has some kind of reverb or on it. And something like that just makes sure that the audience, you know, hears it, because it's easy to miss something in a film. So I think things like that are really useful, like to not think that those are categories that aren't available to you, or not categories, sorry, techniques that aren't available to you just because you're in one genre or another. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure, I always wonder, because I have a 5-year-old, if some of the stuff she watches has subliminal messaging, because they get so addicted to it. Like, I have no idea how it could be that appealing, but I haven't tried anything like that.
And yes, I have done that. Like sometimes when I'm working with my sound mixer in the final re-recording mix, I'll have like a scene where I'm like, I want this to be more uncomfortable in the sound, and he can play with frequencies that you can't really hear or distinguish from all the other sounds, but it's there, and it, I don't know, creates some discomfort that I can notice because I've listened to it too many times. And yeah, I love sound design. I think it's one of the fun parts of the process because you're already picture locked, so there's only so much you can do with the film to make it better. And obviously, sound, I think, makes it so much more of an elevated experience if it's a rich oral world. And I know for me, like, I love when films feel very handcrafted. And so, like, for me, I would be like on my iPhone recording random Foley sounds of like lots of moments in my film. And that was like over the course of like 5 months, where I'd be like, this is the lighter sound in that one moment, or like, this is the sound of that door creak, or this. So that's like the level of care that I put into it.
And you can play, like we did with some of the darker moments in the film, like the sound you're actually hearing is thunder or bad weather. I mean, there's like things that you can put in that we do have like a visceral response to, but you're not depicting them literally. Or like with Ali, because her music career spanned from the 1960s to the nearly 2020, we have a lot of old technology just because of the ways that things were recorded. And so just making sure that the projector, that the tape deck, or the 8-track, or any of those things that she was using to record, or, the reel-to-reels, like all of that, I think, helps put you in the present tense of that moment. And it makes it feel more like 1970 or whatever the moment was when she was writing that piece, which I think really helps sell the audience, on the experience and the narrative.
I guess I don't have much experience with, actually soundscaping for film. Oftentimes I put samples of things in music, and there was a song that I did called Misery a few years ago that had a sample. I think I got it off of TV, just a random laugh. A woman was laughing, and when I saw the film, I thought it was really interesting because there were a lot of fast clips happening, and the director placed a woman smiling right after the laugh, and instinctively it made me feel as though I was watching just after she had laughed. It was a completely strange timing. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it sort of planted that in my head, and I thought it was interesting. Yeah, I am. Yeah. It had to have been. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience right now? Otherwise, I can keep asking too. Oh, yeah.
Can you each give an example of a film that has, because it is so perfectly done, inspired you?
In sound or just in any way?
Sorry?
Like in music or in any way?
Any film that you've seen that is so perfectly constructed that it has inspired you or given you some further idea of what you're going to do?
That's a tough question. I don't know if I want to take that first. I know. It's like I tend to go back into comedy, and so for me, like the perfect films that have been done are like Blazing Saddles and all the Monty Python and films like that. So there's a lot of different construction that we're talking about like that when it comes to comic moments versus like music or sound. But then they always use elements of either Foley or special effects or things like that, or the music and the tension in there as well too. But what have the Romans ever done for us? That was very badly answered. I'll let someone else take it.
You did good.
I mentioned a lot of movies earlier, but one soundtrack I love that I used to listen to a lot as a kid was the James Horner Titanic soundtrack, and yeah, I love that soundtrack, and the movie, it goes well with it.
I can't say that the film is perfect, and I wouldn't even know how to make that I'm not a filmmaker, or I don't know how they did it, but speaking of just moments, this movie 7 Pounds with Will Smith and Rosario Dawson, there's a moment where they're together, and the music that's playing is it bothered me so much because it's a very dissonant chord where it's two half notes that are playing and pounding through the thing, but it's speaking to, without giving anything away, it's speaking to the what Will Smith's character is wrestling with, and it's just beautifully done. And I always thought that was interesting, to use music in what someone might perceive as incorrect notes to create tension. And then, you know, obviously with music, it's the release is always something that you're kind of waiting for, but it never let up. And I thought that was really interesting. But yeah.
I mean, I it's hard. I always shy away from the word perfect. Like, I just feel, you know. Yeah, I mean, a movie that just came to mind that I loved, and I thought the music in it was just so artfully done and such a challenging story, was If Beale Street Could Talk. If Beale Street Could Talk. And I just, like, I'm a huge James Baldwin fan, and I was like, how do you put that into a movie? And the way that the cello became like a character in that soundtrack, and I think that was such an interesting instrument to choose. And then the music in the film there was a meta-narrative with it, even though it was definitely a traditional score. Because there's like fun stuff like Quentin Tarantino. It's like so fun. Like, you learn a bunch of songs you never would have heard of, and they're almost like sometimes at the expense of the film. They're like overshadowing, but he gets away with it, and it's great. But if there was like a film I saw where I was just like, God, the music was a character, but it wasn't overwhelming, and the story did justice to the story, I guess that would be one that comes to mind.
I've got like a Clockwork Orange coming into my head all of a sudden.
I saw that. I didn't want to say that because it's like, but that's tough. I mean, he was the master, so that was like, that is the film. He did like everything. It was like the classical, the counterpoint songs and counterpoint, children's songs, like, and then also like just actual score. That, I mean, there's every musical sort of thing that you could probably attempt in that film. Yeah.
This is all great. If there aren't more questions right now from the audience, I'll come back in a second and check in. But I thought and Alexis, you mentioned like not overpowering or not doing too much. And I think most of you, I think all of you have been in situations where you're either making music for a film, composing for a film, or making music that maybe later gets incorporated into a film, or you're working with a composer for a project, or you're working with you're building a soundtrack. And so I'm curious, kind of, you know, what all of those I think are different ways of working, right, and different ways of incorporating music into a project. And I'm curious, you know, what that back and forth looks like between the various stakeholders, whether it's composers or whether you're working on licensing tracks or whatever it might be, and what kind of actions and processes and practices kind of improve that relationship or that back and forth and make it something like a positive experience. I think we've kind of had maybe pieces of this, but just kind of maybe even like specific examples in your work that showcase what can happen when across those different situations, whether it's working with composers or licensing tracks or whatever it might be.
Well, this is, I think, just speaking to your question, not a direct answer, but one of my mentors when I was an editor is this woman, Barbara Tulliver, who edited a lot of David Mamet's work in his like really good days. We won't talk about him now, but he had this thing that he would say, which was like that the editor was the only person who was really working in service of the story, because if you're a DP, you want your best camera work to show, even if it might not necessarily be pushing the narrative. And if you're basically if you're an actor, you want as much screen time as you possibly can get. And the editor inherits this material. They don't have any of the baggage. They weren't on set, and they just see what's in the frame, which is really the only thing your audience actually sees. They don't have the feelings the director had about what they wish they'd gotten that day or any of that. And so they're able to really just serve the story. And I think that's a challenge when you're writing music for film, because it's very different than writing music to perform where you're the centerpiece of it. And there's times where music can be the centerpiece in a film, and then there's times where it really needs to be a supporting player. And I think, with composers, I mean, it was interesting to me working with Mark Mothersbaugh, who was someone like we were very lucky to get in the film. He was friends with Ali. He's a very established composer. So he was very generous with the amount of music that he wrote, but his time was limited. And what he gave to me was almost like every song with like a lot of stems, which if you don't work in music, it's like basically every instrument, every sound that is a piece of the song separated out. So if you had like, I was like, God, if I had a year with a music editor just to do this, I would have the most amazing score. But it was really challenging because it actually really did give me the reins, which was amazing. But then there's a part of me that's like loves a composer that comes in and just dials everything in and really, and then I can just give notes specifically on what I'm hearing. Whereas in that case, like I don't want to say infinite choices, but it felt like that at times. There was such a large volume of material to work with. But my best experiences have been a little bit more collaborative that was very collaborative in a different way, but where the composer really knows what they're trying to do and is also open to my ideas, and when something's not working we can talk through it and fix it, but that fundamentally there's like a very strong vision and they're bringing that vision and that perspective to it is another layer of the collaboration and making the film.
I know I worked for a very legendary director in post-production, and you can look it up because it's in my bio, but he would work with legendary composers like, Alexander Desplat and James Horner and James Newton Howard. And anyway, he would give them sort of like the scene with the temp score, and then, they would give him their work, and oftentimes he ended up just not even using any of their pieces at all. And I always found that so strange because I'm sure those legendary composers, put a lot of work trying to impress this great director. And anyway, I think this director didn't want to insult these great composers by asking them to do multiple iterations or to actually sort of like get it to the place that he wanted it, and so it was easier just to use like Bach or whatever he wanted to use. And I remember what I learned from that is that I wanted to work with composers who would be open to collaborating and having sort of an iterative process, because I think if you get to a certain level, I guess, in your craft and career, it gets maybe less iterative because you're like a genius, and why would you take notes from someone who's not a legendary filmmaker? And even then you probably wouldn't. So I guess I haven't had that experience yet, but I've enjoyed working with like a lot of the sort of early career composers I've worked with, because I think they've been really open-minded about collaboration and sort of like bringing their own ideas to something, and then also being willing to like totally scrap that if it doesn't work and like try something totally different, because sometimes you think certain instruments will work or sounds will work and then it just like doesn't, and sometimes it's easier to like start over, and not every person wants to like put in the time or even like have that approach, and so I like working with people who are okay with that kind of work style.
In my experience, unfortunately, I've spent more of my time in this realm with, sort of after the fact. There's no creative collaboration. Someone hears something that I've done and has a vision for it, and they place it. I've done a few, had a few moments in my career where it's been a collaborative process, and I think I'm actually interested in doing more. I have a couple demos if you're I think the intellectual honesty, the removing your ego and staying radically open-minded is a very yes and thing with collaboration. Even when if we were just writing a song together, it would have to be like we can't deny it may take me a long time to come around to the idea that you're pitching or understand where you're coming from, but I at least have to consider it in my mind somewhere. And I think that the same is true for when you're asked to revise something. And if you're asking for more time in this part of the song, so if you can, sort of make a more pregnant pause until the next note. it's really it's my job as a creative to imagine a scenario where that makes sense musically. You know what I mean? So I think that the best advice I could give is just being, like I said, radically open-minded. You know, yeah.
So me, I think on like This Is Love, I was working with Rudy's dad hand in hand. So I don't feel like I had to do that much because he was there watching along with me and he was genius. He'd just do it. And so we'd have it. So to me, that seemed very easy. Then on the last film, Little Satchmo, which was about the secret daughter of Louis Armstrong, we had a brilliant composer and producer named Eddie Corvin, who was with Blue Rock Studios in East Village and had recorded Rolling Stones and David Bowie and all these guys. And we would just basically say what we needed, and he did all that very, we would send him the cut, he would come back with some stuff, so it was very hands-on with him. And then he did his own original composition based on Louis Armstrong music that I think it was nominated for something important. But it was all a very collaborative thing, and I don't feel like I had to do that much. So I was really lucky that way. I just kind of leaned on the geniuses who, were brilliant at doing that for the film, and everything worked out fine. Maybe I got lucky.
Or it's trust, I think putting trust in people to.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, much more so than I. I'm just like a music fan or lover when it comes down to that, and this is like what they do. So trust. Yeah,
and I think too, it's like I think that feels so important because I think there can be filmmakers can get so attached to, understandably, right? It's like your baby, it's your it's your prized project, but I'm sure like some of that collaboration and like pushing the project forward comes when you're willing to like give it to someone to see what they can add to it too,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I can keep asking questions too, but I just want to, before we run out of time, ask.
If anybody else wants to do this, please do it.
You're doing a great job.
You're speaking about collaboration. This is a very collaborative art form, filmmaking. When you feel that you need to communicate what you want and it's not exactly there yet, what terminology do you use? You said if somebody needs a pause, that's a verbiage there that's what I'm asking in general. How do you how do you tell them with that? This question's clear. You're nodding.
I mean, I started my career as an editor, and that was really helpful to me, or has always been helpful to me since, because when you're editing, they'll recognize a symptom, a scene's not working, and if you get notes like that are very specific, that's often not the solution. It's much more helpful to hear, I wanted it to be the joke to land more, or I wanted it to be scarier, or I needed to feel more tension, or it felt rushed, and when someone says, change this word and do this, you can put that in, it might not solve the problem, and then you're even farther from a solution because you've sort of lost the plot a little bit. So I try really hard not to be too specific unless I really know that like that's the thing, and try to just say like what my intention is in the change or what my goal is, and then trust like this is someone, like I'm not a musician, you know how to write music, you can make it feel more in this feeling, but I'm not going to say like the piano really needs to be, fortissimo here or something like that. So I think, but it's still hard because you kind of have to censor yourself because like all of us think we know the answer, at some point, or that something will be so simple. But I think you just have to remember that they're keeping a lot of balls in the air and navigating something that's got other moving parts that you might not be thinking of. So the more that you can just speak to your intention or your goal or your vision and let them figure out how to get there, I think the more successful you can be.
Yeah, I think I agree so much with what you're saying. The best way to for me, especially with someone who may not have the musical language or the background. Adjectives, very descriptive words, trying to paint a picture in my head, leaning on emotion really helps me understand exactly what they're after. Well, I may not need the specific musical terminology, but it definitely is an assist when they're, like you said, scary or tenser in this moment, or so.
I know I try to be pretty direct, because if I, out of a people-pleasing spirit, if I don't really say what I mean, then it ends up taking a lot longer than it needs to get to where it needs to be. So I like to be direct, but also concise. So I don't want to say too much, because then it could get confused, and to start with like the biggest note, or like and I'm pretty abstract with it. It's not like this piano or A minor. It's more like this needs to be slower, like something pretty simple, and like it's clear what I mean, because I think if one is overly abstract, your definition of like sad might be different than like that composer's definition of what sad sounds like. So I try to use like playable words, actionable words that are like specific.
So would you use a word like, you say slower?
Analog, for example, like sometimes even if they're using digital means to make it sound that way, I'll say like, can it sound more analog, like more physical, tactile, or I don't know. Those are like the kinds of words I like, but I don't think there's like a right way. This is just what I do.
That's really. I think I got the song in my head now.
I like the word synthy. I'm like, synthy, make it synthy.
Go really wildly abstract and say something like, this needs more orange, or this is a flowing river, or something like that.
That's not how I talk. I'm very practical, so I like don't. It doesn't even come in my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight what you said about someone else's slower, or someone else's sad means. So if you say orange to me could mean Halloween. So I'm gonna give you Michael Myers.
I was thinking fruity.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Jungle.
Think of a question.
I work with a lot of young people who have music as part of their life. When did you know this was the direction you were going to go, and how did you get there?
My parents were both music teachers. Mom was an opera singer, and my dad was a college music professor. I didn't have much choice. I'm like the failure going into film.
Oh, but you're in love though too. So you got.
And both of my sisters are professional singers, so I couldn't
Comes
escape
from
it.
two musical families.
Yeah. And I was adopted by that family.
Oh no, please go ahead. Short answer: I always knew it. Even when I wanted to be a superhero as a kid, it would have been moonlighting as a musician. So, yeah.
I've got video of that too.
Yeah. True story.
I knew pretty young, but I feel like we push kids to make choices. Like the least favorite question that my daughter gets asked is, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Because she's 5, and I just think it's such a like silly thing to try to start to like write your story before it's written and define it. And I think there's this really good quote that I'll butcher from Ira Glass, the NPR guy, about being a beginner. And I think it's so much more important to find out what you like when you're young and what you're passionate about. You're not going to be good at it anyways. So this idea that we're all supposed to be born with like some preternatural talent and then pursue it at a young age is just, I think, so unfair. And you do get to a point later where you might wonder if you should have tried other things, or if that's the best way to measure yourself. And I think in the quote he basically says like what makes you interested in something is that you're drawn to it and you have good taste, and so you want to make things that reflect the quality of the things that your good taste draws you to, but your first stuff comes out and it's kind of not that great. And he's like, the only way you make it great is by practicing and keeping doing it. And I think that figuring out what you're passionate about and interested in is so much more likely to get you there, to the point that you're going to have the just the discipline to keep practicing and to fail over and over again. And I think there's like a little bit more of a model in our society that you're supposed to just sort of like come out with like this incredible talent and just be this, and all knowing, and and not do the work. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think it's more something that I think it's probably the hardest question to answer, really, is like, what do you really love? Like, what's in your mind that you'd really, in your fantasy world, be doing if everything was available to you? And answering that question as opposed to like that idea of writing a story about yourself that like you're going to grow up and become something or just fulfill some identity.
I think decided to be a filmmaker in college, and it was like a series of different sort of existential and philosophical questions I had to answer for myself, because being a practical person and also being from Los Angeles, I knew about the entertainment industry. I knew people who had creative professional paths, but I was so sort of like pragmatically thinking about like financial stability and like how am I gonna, I don't know, have a salary and make money and live and survive. And I think the philosophical question that I had to like answer first was, okay, well, let's say I do end up getting a job where I do make a lot of money and I do become rich. Like, will I actually be happy with that job and that existence and that paycheck? And so I sort of like did the internship at Goldman Sachs and sort of like saw the path forward by meeting other people at investment banks and venture capitalists, and sort of realizing that like I wasn't that excited about markets and the price of oil and I don't know, whatever it was. And I started to think that I would probably become suicidal if I actually did like try that path. And so then I was like, okay, back to square one. And I already felt like even at 18 that I was like too old to like, I don't know, pick a path, because I was like, oh, if you want to be an artist, you have to start like when you're 8 and have Super 8 camera and be like Steven Spielberg. And so again, I didn't think directing. I was like, maybe I'll be like an agent or a manager and I'll, you know, work at like a mailroom in Hollywood, because that's what people do in entertainment. And I read like the book The Mailroom and different books about sort of different media moguls. And in sort of like doing my research and talking to people, execs and managers and reps, I sort of found that there were like two camps in entertainment. There were like people who were unhappily doing their sort of businessy entertainment job because they were sort of like repressed creatives who were really actors and writers and directors who like told themselves they just were okay with being adjacent to doing the arts, and were kind of unhappy in those positions, but you know, had good salaries. And then there were people who actually really liked their jobs and were doing those jobs. And I realized, I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to be that person who's like secretly like wanting to be a director or I don't know, like a writer or something creative, and just pursuing like something practical because it's adjacent to the creative thing. And so that was like the next philosophical question I had to answer, which is like, why do I not think that I can be creative? And like what were like the narratives I had already sort of told myself about like what kind of, I don't know, life I could live, or I don't know. So I just, there were like many questions I kind of navigated through, and so this is how I ended up here.
Thank you all. We probably have time for one more question. So, yeah, back there.
I was wondering, as filmmakers, whether you thought it was easier and preferable to rely on an individual composer for your soundtrack, or whether it was better to get a music director and use licensed source music from a variety of different sources.
I will start on that one. I would say it all depends on the budget. Because I mean, there's, you know, that kind of determines a lot of what you're able to do. So if and the licensing may not be very inexpensive either. It can be very expensive. So it's all these decisions you'd have to make. I'll just throw that one out and let the panel.
I'll say I'm not a filmmaker. If you need it. You don't have to license anything. You just, I'll do it for real cheap.
That's all.
I mean, I think my favorite films, a music documentary that's sort of its own genre, because of course it'd be ridiculous to do and not use the music of the artist or that you're depicting. But that aside, I think a really beautiful score, I think, just brings so much cohesion to a film. And sometimes, you need a more famous song that makes an impact in a certain moment. But I tend to be, I think, more drawn to those types of films. That said, I make mostly music documentaries, so I'm usually dealing with everything that Sean was talking about, which is can be very. You have to just have a good sense of your own blood pressure and everything, because the music licensing business
it's rough.
is brutal, especially like the film that I just did. Like, September is the 5th most popular pop song in the history of music. That's not a fun one to license. So you just.
We didn't have the budget to license, but that said, there were producers and musicians that we worked with who were part of the making of really big mainstream top 40 hits, and work with Pharrell and work with big producers, but because of where they are in their careers, they're not often credited, or they're paid very little, and they don't have their names on those songs. And so I think there are a lot of musicians who are just having their credit and getting ownership, to your point earlier, of the song. And like I said, being credited and paid, it's a big deal, because just because you work with Pharrell doesn't mean you're even if you wrote the song, doesn't mean you get credited for writing the song. And so there are so many talented musicians in there. It doesn't even matter what age, just that are happy and excited to get credited, basically.
And a previously recorded song will just never punctuate them. I mean, there's times in a movie where it's sublime, but a score is going to dial into every moment that you want to hit and create an immersive world. And even if it's if you think of a movie like Fargo by the Coen brothers, it's you hear that music and you enter that world and you stay there, and it just serves them so much. And to imagine that film with a bunch of previously recorded tracks, I mean, you wouldn't want to. And I think there's a lot more films, I think, that fall in that direction than in the Quentin Tarantino direction with a Pulp Fiction soundtrack.
Well, I think that does it for time. So I just want to say thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing all your insights about music and the relationship between music and film. I think this was really just a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for all the great questions and for coming and joining in this conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.